The events today are just truly awful, and I know the whole country is deeply shocked at what they've seen and what they've heard. I do want to thank the emergency services of Merseyside Police who've had to respond to the most difficult of circumstances today. But I do also think about the emergency responders because they have responded to an awful incident today, and I want to thank them for the professionalism that they have shown in doing so.
The UK government has ruled that a man who meticulously planned the stabbing of children at a dance studio, possessed an Al-Qaeda manual, and attempted to produce the deadly poison ricin is not a terrorist. This decision has sparked national outrage and accusations of a deliberate cover-up to protect failing institutions. Keir Starmer's government is now scrambling to create an entirely new legal category for these attacks, rather than admit the obvious, that their counter-terrorism prevent program catastrophically failed these children after Rudakubana was referred to them 3 times. The question everyone's asking, what's really behind the refusal to call this terrorism? If we're being honest, the question of what constitutes a terrorist seems deliberately murky in the case of Rudakubana. What exactly does a terrorist look like if not someone who meticulously planned a mass killing, possessed an Al-Qaeda manual, and experimented with deadly poisons? The evidence is staring us in the face, yet the government persists with semantic gymnastics to avoid the T-word. Let's examine the cold, hard facts. Rudakubana didn't just wake up one morning and decide to attack a Taylor Swift dance class.
On the 29th of July last year, Rudakubana left home and travelled by taxi to the Hart Space in Hart Street, Southport, armed with a large kitchen knife, which he had bought on the internet on the 13th of July, 16 days earlier. There were 26 children in the party, all of them happy and enjoying themselves. It started at about 9:30 that morning on a warm summer's day, but he had targeted those very young children, and over about 15 minutes he savagely killed 3 of them and attempted to kill 8 more, as well as 2 adults who tried to stop him.
This was calculated terrorism by any reasonable definition. He possessed an actual Al-Qaeda training manual, not exactly bedtime reading for your average troubled youth. He wasn't just fantasizing about violence. He was actively producing ricin, one of the deadliest poisons known to mankind, following instructions from that very manual. His attack wasn't impulsive but meticulously planned over months, complete with reconnaissance of his target, timing considerations, and an escape strategy. Yet somehow, according to our authorities, he lacked ideological motivation. This determination becomes even more baffling when you consider Rudakubana's documented obsession with Hitler, Genghis Khan, and the Rwandan genocide. These weren't casual interests. They were fixations that shaped his worldview and ultimately his actions. If a fascination with history's most notorious mass murderers doesn't constitute ideological motivation, what does? The attack itself bears all the hallmarks of terrorism.
Axel Rudakubana, who is 18, pleaded guilty at Liverpool Crown Court to murdering 3 young girls. The British man accused of the Southport attack, in which 3 young girls were stabbed to death, has changed his plea on the first day of his trial, pleading guilty to all charges. He also pleaded guilty to the attempted murder of 8 other children and to the attempted murder of Leanne Lucas and Jonathan Hayes.
Rudakubana carefully selected a vulnerable target, young children at a dance class, knowing they would be defenseless. He planned his approach and escape routes with military precision. Most chillingly, he structured his attack to maximize casualties rather than targeting specific individuals. This wasn't personal, it was political in the broadest sense, an attack on innocence itself. During those horrific 12 minutes, Rudakubana moved with calculated efficiency. He didn't rampage wildly but systematically targeted victims, particularly focusing on children. 3 beautiful young lives, Elsie Stancombe, Baby King, and Alice da Silva Aguiar, were stolen, and 8 other children were critically injured alongside 2 adults who heroically tried to protect them. Each step, each movement, each thrust of his knife was executed with the cold precision that defines terrorism. What's particularly galling is the government's contradictory position. They've created an entirely new legal category, non-terrorist mass casualty attack planning, which, conveniently, carries the same life sentence as terrorism. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, why create a new species called duck-adjacent waterfowl? This semantic shuffling serves no practical legal purpose, but has profound implications for how we track and prevent such attacks.
It was of such extreme violence of the utmost and exceptionally high seriousness that it is difficult to comprehend why it was done. On counts 1 to 3 murder, I sentence him to custody for life with a minimum term which he must serve in custody of 52 years. On counts 4 to 11, I sentence him concurrently to custody for life with a minimum term of 18 years, less 175 days served, on each count concurrently with each other.
Jonathan Hall KC, the government's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, actually recommended against expanding the definition of terrorism, citing concerns about false positives. But we must ask, who exactly are they trying to protect with this narrow definition? Not the children of Southport, certainly. False positives might mean some individuals receive additional scrutiny, but false negatives mean more dead children. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's careful linguistic shift is equally telling. He now speaks of extreme violence carried out by loners, rather than acknowledging any ideological motivation. This deliberate pivot away from terrorism terminology suggests a political calculation, rather than an honest assessment of the facts. Most damning of all is the revelation that Rudakubana slipped through the Prevent Counter-Terrorism program 3 separate times because he didn't fit a clear ideological mold.
We have to be very, very careful about the suspect, the defendant, who has been charged now with the murders of 3 kids and attacking kids. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and indeed the police knew that there was a terror-related aspect to Axel Rudakubana.
Well, I think the timing was very carefully engineered. I think my own sense is that Keir Starmer and the Home Secretary knew perfectly well about these extra details.
The system, designed to identify potential terrorists before they act, failed catastrophically because its definition of terrorism was too rigid, too focused on established extremist groups rather than the evolving nature of lone wolf terrorism. Rudakubana wasn't waving an ISIS flag or posting Al-Qaeda manifestos online, so the warning signs were ignored despite his obvious fascination with mass murder. The government's classification decision is already causing shockwaves beyond political circles. Families of those lost in the Southport tragedy have voiced profound outrage, feeling the bureaucratic labeling undermines both the severity of what happened and their personal grief. Patrick Hurley, Southport's Labour MP, has publicly demanded a review of Rudakubana's sentence, calling it unduly lenient given the horror of what transpired. This isn't merely an academic debate about terminology. Security experts are now warning that this classification approach creates a dangerous blind spot that could leave us vulnerable to future attacks. By refusing to expand our understanding of who presents a threat, the government risks missing individuals who don't fit neatly into outdated terrorist profiles but are equally dangerous. The real question facing Britain isn't what label we apply to these acts of extreme violence, but whether our institutions can evolve beyond rigid definitions to identify emerging threats before tragedy strikes again. As the inquiry moves forward, families deserve more than just carefully crafted political language. They deserve a system that won't let another killer slip through existing safeguards multiple times.